Hello, and welcome to the 5th lecture of the semester for English 421Y, and the first for Unit 2. In this video, I will briefly describe the assignment for this unit, discuss the differences between instructions and procedures, and then focus on the particular features of textual instructions. Unit 2, going to the assignment sheet really quick, is all about instructions and procedures. The goal of this project will be to develop 2 sets of instructions on a similar topic for an actual situation with a slightly different purpose and audience. For the first part of Unit 2, you'll be developing a set of instructions and procedures that are primarily textual. That is, they are mostly written. They might have design features and some images, but the primary meaning is communicated through text. The second part of the unit, which I'll describe in the next video lecture, will be primarily visual. Yes, there can be some text, but the primary meaning needs to be communicated through images. As I said, in this video I'm going to focus primarily on the textual instructions. But first, I want to talk a little bit about choosing the scenario for this project. As I said, you'll be choosing an actual situation in which your instructions could really be used. This is called the scenario. The scenario provides a realistic, rhetorical situation for your writing, including a real setting in which your document could actually be written, an audience that would need or want to use your document, and a specific purpose for which they would use it. It works best to imagine a situation related to a job, position, internship, or whatever that you've actually held, so that you're basing your decisions off of an actual situation and a real audience. This project is hardest when you have to do more creative or imagination, where you have to imagine an audience that you don't actually know, or imagine a situation in which you have not actually been yourself. Most of this should be based on your own experiences. The second decision that you need to make is whether to do instructions or procedures. In Essentials of Technical Communication, Chapter 10, the authors describe procedures as, quote, general guidelines for performing a task, end quote, and instructions as specific detailed steps. With instructions, the order and exact method are very important. You need to do things starting with step 1 and proceeding through step 10. If you mix the steps up, if you do them out of order, if you do them incorrectly, the final result is going to be different than what you should be getting. In contrast, procedures describe information in an order that makes sense for the reader or the writer, but is not fixed and requires fewer specific details. With procedures, the exact order in which you complete the steps is less important. If you do things out of order, or if you skip a step because you don't need to do it, it's not going to completely destroy your end product. They're a little bit looser, they're a little bit more open to interpretation. I think of the difference between instructions and procedures as the difference between explaining how to play a board game versus how to build Legos. With a board game, you can start at any point and present information in multiple ways, while still achieving the same effect. If the first thing that you describe is how to win, and then you describe how a turn works, and then you describe how you move pieces, and then you explain what the board looks like, that information can be communicated in any order. With Legos, however, if you're trying to build a specific thing and go out of order, or don't put in key details, suddenly the spaceship that you're building turns into a race car, or into some weird blob of bricks. The order makes a difference in instructions, whereas the order in procedures is not as fixed and not as important. Detail and accuracy are necessary for effective procedures, but they are looser, as I said, and more open to interpretation. For this assignment, you can do either. But it's important to match your choice to the specific scenario, audience, and purpose for which you are writing. Once you decide what your scenario is going to be and start determining what you're actually describing, you'll get a pretty quick sense of Does this need to be very fixed instructions, or can it be looser procedures? The third decision that you need to make for the textual instructions is to choose a medium, print or digital, and then an established genre. Medium, in this case, is how you are presenting the information. Is it primarily going to be printed? Is it going to be printed and laminated? Is it going to be something that people access as a PDF? Is it going to be something that's accessed as a PDF on a tablet versus a PDF on a computer or a PDF on an e-reader? Is it going to be something that gets pulled up as a Word document? Is it something that the reader actually needs to fill information out on, such as a form? All of these are choices of medium, how it is being conveyed to the reader. The next thing that you need to think about is the genre of that medium. For instance, there are many different kinds of videos. A video is a medium, but a YouTube video is a genre. A tasty BuzzFeed video is a genre. A 30-minute cooking show is a genre. There are very specific things that make that genre a genre. With the textual instructions, genre can be a little bit more confusing than with the visual instructions. You need to think about what is an established type of document that might exist within your scenario. For instance, a lot of instruction manuals are a typical genre, but there can be subgenres within that. For instance, you might have a diagram that has very specific instructions on how to assemble components. You might have a manual that is on a workbench in a laboratory that tells you specifically how to do the steps in a chemical reaction. The choice of genre is typically reflected by the workplace, by the scenario in which you are writing. That, again, is why I'm asking you to choose a scenario that you have experience in, because you're able to look at that scenario and think, okay, well, this is a document they actually use. This is a document that I remember seeing. This is a document that I remember using. I'm going to do something similar to that. Determining the medium and an appropriate established genre that will be familiar to your reader will make writing both documents much easier, as you will have a stable notion of the type of document you are creating. You don't have to do so much heavy lifting or imaginative work to determine what that scenario or what that genre and medium is. If you have experience within the scenario, within the actual setting, then you should have a pretty good idea of what it might look like. Once you determine the scenario, the genre, and the medium, and decide whether you're writing instructions or procedures, you should look for examples similar to the type of documents you want to write, including but not limited to those I posted on Blackboard. I'll talk about those in a second. Beyond this class, looking for examples is an important habit to get into when writing professionally, because different companies have their own notion of what instructions should look like, and there are significant differences based on how and where the document is published. I know that when I've been in a workplace before, I always ask for examples. Someone asks me to do something, I say, yeah, I'd be happy to. Do you have an example of what you want this to look like? And if they don't, then whatever I create has the potential to become the example in the future. I'll come back to the assignment sheet here in a second, but it talks in a little bit more detail about selecting a topic, choosing an audience and scenario, what the length, genre, and medium should look like, and that kind of information. I want to shift gears here for a second and talk about an example of a very, very well-known type of instructions, the recipe. Recipes are instructions, and sometimes procedures, that are very, very well known to almost everyone. We've all used a recipe of some sort. Even if you don't identify as a chef or a cook or a baker, you've probably followed a recipe at some point in your life. Recipes are interesting because they are primarily textual. While often accompanied by pictures, they're usually mostly numbered lists, short paragraphs, info boxes, ingredient lists, that kind of thing. Recipes can be both instructions and procedures depending on what you're making. Baked goods tend to be more specific and require a fixed order, while something like a salad or a soup might be a little bit looser. It doesn't matter roughly when you put the ingredients together. Whereas with baking, if you don't do things exactly as they're listed at the exact time and to the exact specifications, you can get something very, very bad. That's coming from experience. Recipes can be print or digital, and most digital recipes have a printable version so people can choose what format makes sense for them. Finally, as recent social media trends show, even established genres like recipes change. More on this in the next lecture. So I want to give an example of a pretty simple recipe for a chocolate cake. And yes, this video is going to make all of us hungry. This is from the website allrecipes.com, which is a sort of public database of recipes. You can see there's a brief description, a title, a very appealing picture, and then immediately an ingredients list, directions, cook time, numbered steps, and then at the bottom you have some tips. This is a fairly conventional format for most recipes. Pretty much any recipe that you look at is going to have this same basic information. However, that information is going to be presented in different ways. It may also include more or less detail. This is a very stripped down and direct recipe. More complex recipes might have longer paragraphs, while recipes where the order is less important may not necessarily have the numbered list. You may not always see cook time available. That typically is something that you find on these kind of professional sort of websites, whereas a blog may not necessarily have that information. You can also see there's a lot of other things on here that you don't necessarily get, such as the calories, an advertisement for buying your eggs somewhere, these kinds of things. Now, this recipe, again, is from a major recipe database. So it's meant to be very straight, very direct. It's mostly user-submitted information, and it has reviews, star ratings. This one has over 2,000 reviews, so you know that this is something that's established. You can also go down and read the reviews, read what people, recommendations, things that people have done to adapt or change or fix the recipe, that kind of thing. You can also see that this is called One Bowl Chocolate Cake 3. That means there was probably a 1 and a 2. So this has been revised, it's been changed, it's been updated over time. Let's compare this to a recipe from a cooking blog. Again, you can see it's chocolate layer cake, and we get this mouth-watering picture. But then you'll notice immediately things are a little bit different. This is a cooking blog. It's one person who writes it, and it's a little bit different. The blog has more images, more text, there's more background information. It begins with a quote from a recipe book. It talks a little bit more about the kinds of decisions and the quality of the cake. It talks about a little bit more of the writer's personal opinion and personal perspectives and maybe story. There's more of the writer's life in here. But you can also see the pictures are larger, they're better, they're more numerous. Then we get more process images. I really like this one because it shows not just the finished cake, but this is what the cake looks like when you're starting to make it. Then we get into, again, information that you find in every recipe. The ingredients list, the name of the cake, recipe, and then we get to the steps. Immediately you'll notice some things are a little bit different. It doesn't tell you roughly how long the entire recipe will take to make. It doesn't necessarily have the numbered steps. But in general, the information is roughly the same. You will notice that there is a print recipe button. If you click on that, it takes this recipe and turns it into basically what we saw in all recipes. It cuts out the images, it cuts out the more narrative, descriptive writing at the beginning, and just gives you just the straight recipe. The differences between these two recipes are one of audience and medium. A recipe website is all about providing information to an audience who is likely only there to get the recipe, perhaps even opening it while cooking. I do this all the time. I'm making something, I pull out my phone, I go to a recipe, I have it open while I'm cooking, and then I close it. I'm not there to learn about the person's backstory. I don't care about the decisions they made when coming up with the recipe. I don't even necessarily care about the pictures. I just want the recipe. However, there are other times where that information is important to me. Let's say I'm deciding what kind of cake I want to make. I might look at half a dozen different kinds of recipes. I might read about them. I want to decide what the best recipe is for me, what sounds most interesting, what sounds easiest, or what sounds, maybe if I do want something challenging, what is a little bit different than kind of your basic recipe. Blogs, in that case, provide the same information, but to a different audience, one that may be more interested in background information, including the author's thoughts about the recipe and pictures from the process, description of ingredients. These are all choices that the reader makes when deciding what instructions or procedures to seek out. And they're all decisions that the writer makes when developing their documents. While we're on the topic of baking, one of my favorite readings for this unit is called A Microcosm of Technical Writing in the Kitchen While Cooking a Banana Cream Pie. You'll be reading this for Activity 5. It's a short blog post that illustrates one of the biggest challenges when writing any kind of instructions: dealing with a level of reader expertise. The author describes her attempt to make a banana cream pie for the first time and her frustrations with the kind of language that is common to recipes. For example, in response to the directions, "Stir constantly until the mixture is bubbly," she writes, "How long do I have to stir this mixture? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Bubbly means slightly boiled, aerated, or some other state? I stirred and stirred, but apparently not violently enough to get out all the clumps. I swear the mixture never got bubbly, but about 10 minutes into this step, the mixture became thick and creamy, something I wasn't expecting because there's nothing in the instructions that indicated a dramatic change of state." As a novice who had never made this recipe before, key information was left unspecified for the writer because it assumed a certain level of background knowledge. The author's friend who helped her make the pie understood what vague instructions like prick the pie crust or stir until bubbly mean because she's already, quote, familiar with the terminology and methods, end quote, of cooking. The author was not familiar with that language, with that terminology, and therefore had a much harder time reading specialized technical instructions that left out some of that information. This recipe that the author followed really was for a more advanced user, that it assumed that they knew what bubbly meant in the context of making a banana cream pie. The reader didn't know that information, and as a result, may have done things wrong, if that makes sense. So the author ends by suggesting that online instructions are superior to text instructions because they are not limited by space and thus allow you to add the extra detail and links pointing to additional pages in drop-down hotspots or through little information pop-ups. In other words, because online instructions are non-linear, that is, you don't start from the beginning and move to the end. You can navigate it as you want. You can click on tabs, you can follow links, you can watch videos, you can look at images, whatever. You can spend more or less time focusing on the areas that you need. It allows users to either ignore information that isn't important to them or to go into a little bit more detail. So if somebody is an experienced cook, when they are reading a banana cream pie recipe, they go, yeah, I know what this means. I know all of this. If they are a novice, they'll read those instructions a little bit differently. They might be more careful. They might need that extra detail that a more experienced reader won't need. It's a balancing act, though, because experienced readers can quickly get annoyed or frustrated if they are stuck in a ton of easy novice background information. We've all been there where it's like, yeah, I don't need that. At the same time, novice users will get frustrated if the information is too complex, or if it moves too quickly, or if they aren't clear about sort of the procedural steps. As you write your document, you need to think about the audiences and what might confuse or lose them or alienate them while they are reading and using your instructions. Next, I want to talk briefly about Graves and Graves, Chapter 8, which is a really, really great explanation of writing how-to documents for instructions, procedures, and manuals. In this chapter, the authors identify 7 strategies for making instructions and procedures easier to use. While all 7 are important, I want to point your attention to the 4 that will be most valuable for our purposes. First, so here are the 7 steps. They are: know your audience or user group, include an overview of the procedures, subdivide processes, write usable steps, illustrate procedures, design an effective page layout, and do usability testing. I want to talk specifically about the first, second, fourth, third, and seventh of these best practices. First is know your audience or user group. Are they experts, novices, or beginners? How much previous experience, knowledge, or training do they have on the topic? How do you create a document that can be accessed by diverse and multiple audiences? In this section, starting on page 225, they go into more detail about this. Second, include an overview of the procedures. Provide an introduction or overview that helps users to gauge whether the document covers the topics they need, gives an indication of who the audience is, and sets up the structure of the document. In other words, it answers the question, how can you set the stage for how the user should actually use the instructions? This section is on page 226. The third step is subdivide processes. This is one of the most important components of instructions and procedures. Subdividing means breaking it down into not just numbered steps, but clearly labeled sections. Instead of making the whole document a long list of steps, use subheadings to group related steps. This is discussed on page 232 and 233. So here they give an example of a non-subdivided list. It's 15 or 16 steps. Here they give an example of the same information, but it is revised using the subdividing, or you'll hear it called the chunking technique, which involves headings, clearly marked sections, numbered and bulleted lists, and it's clearly broken up and subdivided. So instead of having 16 steps, it might have 4 sections, each with 4 steps, or something along that line. Writing usable steps. Usable here means organizing and writing information so that readers can clearly identify the most important information. Usable to the reader. For instance, in a recipe for a pie, the crust and the filling should be split into separate paragraphs, even if one is 7 lines long and the other is only 1. The reader will look for a separate demarcation of these different steps because they're clearly different pieces of the whole pie. If you combine them into one single paragraph, this might throw off the paragraph structure. It might confuse the reader, but it will confuse the reader, sorry. If you combine it into one step, it will confuse the reader. But if you subdivide it into 2 paragraphs, it might throw off the paragraph structure, but it will be much clearer to the reader. Finally, usability testing. Usability testing is something that we are going to do in Unit 3. Usability testing, in other words, is testing how useful and usable your instructions are with a real audience. This is something that they talk about on page 241. I ask you to read this just to kind of get a sense of what we're going to be doing in Unit 3, where you're actually going to be testing the instructions that you develop in Unit 2 with a real audience. Okay, finally, I want to end this lecture with a brief note about topics for this project. I want to go back to the Unit 2 assignment sheet for a second. A good topic for your instructions first should be related to your interests. The more connected you are to the topic and the more first-hand experience you have with the situation and the setting, the more useful and realistic your documents will become because you are more invested in them. The scenario you are required to include for both the text instructions and a separate scenario for the visual instructions will keep your writing tied to concrete situations. A good topic should also be complex and detailed. Considering the theme for this course is writing in complex environments, topics for your instructions should be detailed and intricate rather than simple and easy to explain. You want to select something that is complex, technical, and difficult. You don't want to choose something that is easy. If it's easy, the instructions become less involved. We want instructions that require some work for the reader to understand. This makes the task more challenging, but it also gives you experience maintaining the complexity of technical information rather than, quote, dumbing it down, while also increasing clarity and coherence. A good topic should also be relevant and interesting. Instructions are always read in the moment when someone needs the information they contain. That is to say, no one really wants to read a manual, but they have to in order to complete a task or gain knowledge. Your topic should be relevant in that it's something people need or want to know, and it should be interesting enough that the audience sees its value for their own needs. Fourth, it should be accessible and legal. Two important things to consider when selecting a topic are A, do you have access to the materials related to the topic? Can you actually go and use the materials, take photographs, be in the space? And B, are you allowed to write about it? Are you legally able to detail some of this information? In the past, I've had students who've said, I signed a non-disclosure agreement when I took on this internship, so I actually can't write about this, or I can't include a specific level of detail. It's easier to develop instructions about, say, fixing the engine on an airplane if you have regular access to an airplane in order to take pictures, sketch images, and double-check processes. If you don't have an airplane available to you, you're going by memory, or you're just going by information that you've found in other sources. That's not this assignment. You don't need to cite sources. You are citing your own experience. Even if you have not signed a non-disclosure agreement, double check with a supervisor before you write about a current position, just to make sure it's okay with them. And then finally, a good topic needs to be focused on an angle. An angle is a particular perspective or focus of communication and is closely tied to both purpose and argument. When two people write the same essay about the same topic but go in very different directions, this is a result of the angle they selected. Instructions and procedures about complex processes require an angle to keep the content focused and narrow. For instance, if you're developing instructions on building a computer, your angle might be to only focus on the fan system and on nothing else. You're not going to talk about the monitor. You're not going to talk about the hard drive. You're only talking about the cooling system. This might feel too limited since you are only describing one part of a larger process, but an angle allows you to make decisions about what background information is necessary and to go into a very specific level of detail. Someone would need other instructions to complete the rest of the computer, but your instructions would get them the exact level of detail they need in order to complete the cooling system. That's it for now. Good luck as you start developing your textual instructions.